Hello, Thaddeus. Today we're discussing incels. So, are you ready for a rip-roaring discussion of spreadsheets? What's that? Incels stands for Involuntary Celibate and has nothing whatsoever to do with spreadsheets? Well, that's a bummer. Well, I guess instead of our exciting discussion on spreadsheets, we're going to have another boring discussion on patriarchy, masculinity, identity, and sexuality. Woo. As markers of identity go, virginity is perhaps the worst out there. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't base your person on it. It doesn't have any sort of external markers, and so nobody else, unless you let them know, has any idea whether or not that is part of who you see yourself as being. In contrast, things like race, nationality, gender, they have an external marker either through the body or through a geographical location. And as far as social constructs go, virginity has a lot more to do with property rights than anything that has to do with sexuality. Yet, as an example of how patriarchal notions are harmful to men, the ideology encourages men to shed their status as virgins, thus constructing this loss of virginity as a rite of passage into manhood. Hence, not losing your virginity is seen as losing manliness. While other markers of masculinity can be achieved through personal efforts, such as gaining muscles through going to the gym regularly, losing one's virginity requires a second agent in order to switch the identity marker. Thus, as identity markers go, it encourages displacement of that marker onto a second agent, particularly in terms of sexual access. This brings you to the circular logic of patriarchal sexuality, where men are supposed to be promiscuous and women are supposed to be chaste and pure. Ergo, in crude terms, the ability of one to lose one's virginity is stymied by the very ideology that is encouraging this rite of passage. To accommodate for this massive ideological failure, MRAs have, on behalf of the patriarchy, invented this term involuntary celibate in order to mask the failure of these ideas of sexuality, displacing the locus of blame onto the secondary agent, which in this case is primarily the feminine. This term allows the male identity to buoy itself against its failure to achieve this sexual rite of passage, and thus the male identity is temporarily preserved through blaming the feminine through this displacement. Now, if the Reddit survey of MRAs is to be believed, particularly in terms of the age group of people who identify as MRAs, then your average age of the MRA is between 17 and 20 years old. And to put this in context, according to the CDC, the average age of first sexual encounter in America is about 17 years old, and this is increasingly going up as time progresses. And with that, about 40% of Americans have reported having had sex by that age. By the age of 20, that number jumps to about 70%, so a 30% increase in the age group that typifies your MRA. So in essence, only about a third of the population has had a sexual encounter in their early 20s or in their early college years, and by the mid-20s this number jumps to about 90%. Basically, incels are not exactly any sort of small majority within the American population. It's a pretty common phenomenon. Yet these patriarchal ideological notions of masculinity would encourage them not to admit this fact, because it would mean they wouldn't have achieved this rite of passage, they're therefore not a man, and thus they're encouraged to view themselves as a small, insular minority. Yet, 20 to 25% of the population won't even have had their first sexual encounter until after they're 21 years of age. So these patriarchal notions invert this and suggest that as you age, there's a diminishing chance of you having this encounter, whereas the reality is, as you age, it is much more likely that this encounter will take place. Though I would note that these statistics don't account for being a creepy motherfucker who views women as objects. Thaddeus, I will see you in the future.
My eyes have seen the glory of the gods from the future. They are trampling out the ignorance wherever it is found. They have loosed the knowledge of 100,000 books. Their truth is marching on. They will see you in the future. They will see you in the future.